Very good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Automotive Logistics and Supply Chain Live in what is set to be the world's largest global online conference dedicated to automotive supply chain management. I'm Christopher Ludwig, editor-in-chief here at Ultima Media and Automotive Logistics, and I'll be your host in this event together with our great team here. This event will explore the extraordinary times we're facing in the supply chain. Across 30-plus sessions with more than 70 speakers, we'll be looking at how both the coronavirus crisis, as well as new technology, collaboration, and regulations are redrawing the map of the global automotive supply chain, whether across inbound logistics, manufacturing, finished vehicle, or service parts logistics. We can't imagine a more important time for the industry to come together and share best practice, innovation, and challenges, especially at a time when, frankly, it's so difficult to do that physically. But as this event will show, we can all still work closely together, and at Automotive Logistics, we're providing you a platform to do just that. In fact, for those of you who've been coming to our physical events over the past years, I'm quite confident you're going to find many aspects of our virtual event even better. But when it comes to the automotive supply chain, let's not mince words. The coronavirus crisis has devastated the sector's operations and financials, and we continue to live with tremendous uncertainty. There are questions of survival for some companies, while predicting how the next wave of the pandemic will impact our lives and our freedoms, let alone our economies and supply chains, is certainly keeping many of us awake at night. But the crisis has also revealed many things to us as well. For one, supply chain decision makers and operators have played a central role, first in managing the disruption and shutdowns, then, in many cases, directly in the relief effort itself, especially for the automotive sector, turning some of its plants into ventilators and helping to supply PPE. Later, it was supply chain leaders helping to coordinate the restart and recovery phase. And though we're not out of the woods yet, it's now up to you, the supply chain experts of the world, to lead on the next stage, which is the transformation that must follow. Automotive supply chains have actually proved more resilient than many might have expected when it came to restarting and adapting to the so-called new normal. But the crisis has also exposed digital gaps, where weakness in visibility of goods and products, or not having close digital links with data or customers, can prove particularly damaging. Now is the time for automotive companies to catch up. That's why we want to spend a lot of our time in upcoming sessions and panels trying to navigate this path, discussing what companies need to do to ensure the supply chain is agile and flexible enough to meet the changes that in most cases will be far more long-lasting than even this pandemic. Today alone in our event, we have sessions looking at electric vehicle and battery supply chains, on developing sustainable logistics, vehicle logistics, IT and visibility, China, digital innovation, and leading in supply chain in difficult times. You'll hear from Volvo Cars, Volkswagen Group, Robert Bosch, Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, Adient, Toyota, and many more. And throughout the next 3 days, you're going to hear even more on topics including sales and operations planning, rethinking capacity, engineering, packaging, online sales channels, and so much more, covering many global regions. To take you through this journey, I'll be joined by my colleagues Nimish Ladva and Rich Logan, along with other industry experts and leaders. Before we jump into the content, let me just make a few notes about the platform that we're using to host this virtual conference. You're obviously now in the streaming portal. And here in the Brella platform, you can build your schedule to fit your needs. So watch and join as many sessions as you can, but you can also bookmark and schedule the events, the sessions that you want to follow. We'll also make these sessions available on demand by the next day, so you'll be able to go back and watch anything you missed. Just remember to click past content on the schedule on the Brella platform, and you'll see all the on-demand content available, as well as the opportunity to watch live. These sessions will all be available for up to 30 days after, so you'll have plenty of time to catch up. I also want to make sure that you take advantage of the great networking features of this virtual conference. Hopefully by now, many of you you're using our matchmaking functions, so choose your interests, which helps align you to other guests, so other delegates who share your interest and can help with your different services. Do request meetings, and can I also encourage you, respond to meetings. If someone has requested a meeting, let them know. Don't leave them hanging. It's better to say no sometimes than to not answer at all. Also, make sure you visit our e-booths. It's a great place to get to know companies dedicated to services and expertise in this space, and it's there you can see the products, technology, and the people behind those services. So with that, let me just take a moment to recognize and acknowledge our sponsors and the e-booths that they'll be holding, which I hope you'll connect with. It includes our marquee sponsor, Jeffco, our session sponsors, Sigfox, Cordo Logistics, Inform, CFR Rinkins, DSV Global Transport and Logistics, Glovis, and DP World. Those are panel sponsors, Cosmotech, C&W Courier Network, E2 Open, Jack Cooper, IPL Macro, Kuehne & Nagel, CHEP, Siva Logistics, Maersk, and Gallagher Global Logistics, as well as our special exhibitors, ProTrans, Fract Logistics Services, ProAct, and Evolution Time Critical. Again, please take the time to visit them in your e-booths. Throughout our sessions, please be sure to send your questions and comments directly into the chat, and the moderators will do our best to put those questions to our panelists. Our sessions are also short and sweet by design, so if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure our experts get a chance to answer you, and you should pursue this in the networking as well. We're also going to be running polls periodically throughout the event, and I'd like to just kick us off now with one of them. So I'm going to launch our first poll, which, bear with me one second, I will be activating now. So the poll should be live, so please answer and vote now. What will drive the most significant change in the automotive supply chain over the next 3 to 5 years? So vote when you have, if you can just vote in that poll. Okay, great. I can see that the votes are coming in now, so I'm going to just leave that open for a little bit longer as you do that, and then we'll reveal. You can see the answers moving as we go here. So data analytics is starting to pull ahead, but it looks like it's going to be a bit of a tight race. I'll let the audience continue to vote on that whilst I activate a second poll, which is actually a word cloud. So I'd like you all, in one phrase, to tell us what your top automotive supply chain and priority is. We're going to leave that going for a little while so you can write in it and just tell us in a phrase, whether it's digitalization, electrification, etc. Put it through, and we'll get some sense from you, from the audience, what you're seeing there. So we're going to leave that there for a bit as you go, and you can see we'll run these polls at various points throughout the session. So I will leave that open. In the meantime, I will close our first poll. Okay, thank you for that. So we've already had some interesting results there, and it's great to see you interacting with it. Wonderful. So we'll do that periodically throughout the day. Now that we're all introduced and ready to go, I'd like to move into our first session. And I'm really excited by our first guest who's going to be joining me for a fireside chat. Martin Corner joined Volvo Cars to lead its global supply chain logistics around a year ago after key roles at the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance. He's overseeing a significant transformation in the company's supply chain management operations, as well as in global production and distribution, not least as Volvo ramps up electric vehicles and new plants and production around the world. I think it's fair to say it's a car maker proving agile and nimble in one supply chain I'm sure you'll all be interested to learn more about. So Martin and I will be talking for the next 30 or so minutes, but please do send through your questions as we go. Martin, it's great to have you here.
Thanks. Morning, Chris, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where everybody else in the world. It's a bit strange to be in this online event, but it's great to be speaking with you and hopefully getting some good insights in the next 3 days.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can see from the lovely Scandinavian background there, I think exactly where you are in the world.
Yeah, and this is not my home, obviously. This is Volvo's offices, so my home's not quite so nice as this.
This actually is my home. This is my bedroom wallpaper that you can see behind me. So Martin, let's just kind of start with maybe perhaps a bit with the obvious. We're coming into this phase of the crisis, whether we're in the recovery phase or moving deeper into it, hopefully. This all happened pretty early, if you like, into you kind of taking on this role. And I just wanted to get a sense from you, has that changed much for you in terms of your objectives and visions for Volvo Cars supply chain management organization?
It hasn't. The timing was interesting. We were just at the point from a functional perspective of launching a new global organization, which maybe we can touch on later. But obviously this crisis hit and we went very much into operations mode for a period of time. And I think, again, Volvo Cars has gone through a big expansion in the last 8 years or so, or the last decade. We've more or less doubled in volume and increased our global footprint. So Volvo used to be a European.
Cool. I think we have a moment there where Martin has frozen. We'll just give it a second for him to come back. I'm sure he'll be right with us in a moment. So just bear with us for a second, folks. As you know, this is part of the fun of a virtual event. Just while Martin is getting back, I should note, by way of perhaps further introduction, that Volvo has, I think this week, in fact, Martin can confirm when he's back, is just starting production of its first all-electric vehicle at the Ghent plant that follows the production of the Polestar 2 in China. Whilst Martin is getting back, I just want to let me have a quick look at what some of our results were from the earlier poll. So I'm looking at the phrases that you put through, and I think really interesting to note the biggest response amongst you is actually sustainability. So sustainability listed for those of you watching as the most important phrase, or if you like, objective right now. Visibility and reliability kind of coming close behind them. I mean, it's cost cutting and small, electrification and fairly small. So interesting already to see some of the perhaps defying some expectations there, and I'm quite pleased that in a way sustainability is dominating there and not the coronavirus, which I'm sure for many of you is something you've spent more than enough of your time speaking about. I know we're not through that just yet. And just looking at the other poll that we showed, so just on what will drive the most significant change in the automotive supply chain. And Martin, supply chain sustainability was also Martin. It's good to have you back. We missed you. but you know, this is what happened. So great to have you back. So I think we were just talking about Volvo has basically doubled in size over a period. So you're on this path trajectory, and then we lost you. So please carry on.
Yeah. The context behind what I started to say is that obviously Volvo's growth means we now have multiple plants in China and plants in the US. So in real terms, actually, what hit us first was our operations in China, and I think we managed to cope by being still a relatively small global player, and with a relatively agile value chain system. So I think from the full value chain community, the supply planning side, the manufacturing side, the procurement side, and of course our team, we actually immediately went into sort of daily operations meetings, and actually we were quite dynamic in changing our planning, whether it was vehicle planning or rerouting parts from European factories to China or vice versa, depending on where the actual pandemic was at the point in time. So, you know, when China was closed down, Europe was still open, and vice versa. So I think that if anything, it taught us that we've got very agile systems. We've got a very dynamic team. And in some ways, our size, I think, allowed us to be a little bit more flexible than maybe some of the huge volume OEMs in a way. And I think I'm proud to say it's a little bit subjective, but our CEO was quite proud to say we were pretty much the last to shut down and the first to reopen in most of the regions. And we had a policy that it was really important to maintain and get back to normal within, of course, safe working conditions for people as much as possible, because actually keeping business moving in a normal way is also important for society in the long run. So I think the team, I'd say what I would sum up our value chain, and particularly my team, I'd say we punched above our weight. We were quite agile, and I think our size allowed that flexibility. And some of the logistics partners helped us out a lot. We were moving cars into Italy when Italy was locked down, to get them ready for sale when, of course, the country came out of lockdown. So there was lots of these sort of small movements and agility in the whole value chain.
Were you, during the peak of I suppose, the lockdown, we sort of wondered if it would be taking weeks, if not months, for manufacturing to get back up to speed, and if not, perhaps in a permanently reduced kind of way. Never mind from the demand side. Basically based on supply chain disruption. Have you been somewhat surprised by the resiliency of the supply chain? Because it's not quite been the case, right? It's kind of come back a bit quicker than we would have thought.
Very surprised. I have to say, when it started, I was expecting us to have many more supply problems, enforced shutdowns because of lack of parts availability. But actually, just, I think, clinging on by our fingernails, we've managed to keep the pipeline moving. What I would say is my concern now is actually, if you think particularly on international flows, the global pipeline has become very, very stretched. And as everybody starts to ramp up again, of course, it'll become even more stretched. All the buffers that are maybe with the part supplier in the network or in our plants have been cleaned out. I'm sure that goes for most of the other OEMs. So I think if we have a very successful H2, which is the plan for Volvo Cars, actually the pipeline in some ways, ironically, may be more stretched than it was during the crisis, because obviously the vehicle demand stopped. So we could be a little more creative in moving things and restocking, buffering, ready to start production again.
And it sort of highlights the strategic role there of the supply chain, really, even in the midst of that crisis, if you like, being ready to strike. Of course, we can't rule out further risks of disruption from the pandemic either, but hopefully we can show some further resiliency there too. I want to kind of, not to move away from coronavirus, I'm sure that will come up many times today, but I think it's a pretty important time for Volvo. Correct me if I'm wrong, is it either this week or last week that you've even actually started production of a new electric vehicle, and this is part of pretty ambitious plans to electrify the range and of course roll out more battery electric vehicles. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing specifically in supply chain and logistics to ramp up and prepare for that electrification?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. I think it's one of the exciting parts for Volvo Cars, actually. We are going very aggressive on the percentage of cars that are plug-in electric vehicles within the sort of 5-year business plan horizon. I think the expectation is maybe 50% of our total volume should be electrified within this horizon, which from a supply chain perspective is a huge challenge, and I think it's really exciting. So from a company perspective, it's a strategy that's at the core of Volvo Cars now. Sustainability and becoming a carbon neutral company by 2040 has been declared by our CEO to the outside world, and obviously the tailpipe is a huge part of that. So I think from a supply chain perspective, we all know how complicated the battery component supply chain is and how costly. And I think the challenge on the inbound side, and I'll come to outbound afterwards, is this situation where there's the high cost of doing it, there's the complexity through the operations, and there's also the issue with transporting hazardous goods. And I think the industry is quite immature. The pipelines are long. The component, if we call it that, for the batteries itself is a limited amount of suppliers. And then there's the situation with the clean environments in the battery assembly or packing areas, so multiple handling points. And we're effectively using traditional supply chains. We're using traditional equipment and transportation means. We're using traditional packaging, and we're receiving those parts in the traditional way in all of our manufacturing operations. So you add all of that together and you say, actually, we've got a challenge here, because there's probably next generation battery supply chains where the idea is we look much better upstream to say, okay, from a value chain perspective, what does the ideal value chain look like from an inbound part supply? So we're doing a lot of work on that upstream in the sort of program axis in Volvo, which is very strong. But at the same time, we've got the short-term pressures of handling and managing these components and goods through the current sort of traditional pipeline with the traditional packaging as the volume exponentially increases. So things like good receiving, battery assembly areas, capacity, handling is a big cost and operations challenge. So there's a lot of short-term activity where we're balancing where we put the stress in the supply chain. Do we aggressively push for localization and invest money in tooling for part supply? Do we put the money in the packaging and the logistics area? Do we invest in bigger and better facilities in the manufacturing plants? And that's all a quite organic process. We'll probably get on to my strategy for supply chain logistics, but I think deep collaboration on network design, innovation, future flows, actually collaboration as an industry, which is something I've been passionate about for a while, I think is going to be crucial. Can we have hubs where electric components, battery components, cells and modules pass through that are shared, that are set up maybe by a third-party provider, potentially? So, I mean, it's just one example where somehow we need to almost rip up the current rule book and deeply study with particularly the LSPs and packaging specialists about what the future should look like.
That is interesting. So, I mean, we do anticipate some potential for quite revolutionary change in terms of, as you said, the equipment and packaging and even sort of supply routes coming in. I appreciate that in first electric vehicle for Volvo is here in Europe, but obviously I think a Volvo plant in China has been involved with it before. Are you learning as well from the China experience? Is that playing an important role now for the supply chain you develop here in Europe?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, I think this is one of the positives of Volvo's partnership or with Geely Cars and Geely Auto, sorry. And the learning experience and the speed at which actually the operations in China are learning. And effectively, but the other thing is it's important we're trying to create common global standards and best practice. And like I say, this is a big change for Volvo Cars, and it's why we've created a lot of these global organizations. My organization went global for that reason. We've got a cluster that we call Industrial Operations and Quality, which is the same as what I called Monozukuri when I was in Nissan, for example, which is effectively purchasing, quality, manufacturing, supply chain and planning. And the idea being is we have to look at this from an end-to-end perspective. There's no point me trying to optimize all the logistics flows as a silo versus manufacturing doing the same and procurement. So that's sort of learning of the best balance between the cost drivers and I'd say the mix of investment, fixed cost and investment and depreciation versus life cycle running costs, I think is something we're trying to be much sharper on.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously Volvo with it's almost unique in a way that it's almost part of this group now between Geely and Polestar and other brands as well. So and obviously with more, if you like, control and influence of what's happening in China, obviously not just working through a joint venture. So those are topics we're going to be picking up quite a bit throughout the event. And Martin, I know some of your team is joining us for other sessions as well. So we're quite excited to learn more about that. And indeed, as I mentioned, we'll be covering electrification in a lot of detail. But another topic that I wanted to bring up with you, because I think it strikes me this is something that Volvo in particular is really aiming for, it's quite ambitious in its aim, is in terms of the relationship with the customer through digital channels. So in the crisis period, we saw an increase in online sales, particularly in China, to some extent, I think elsewhere too. Volvo also wants vehicle subscriptions. So to what extent are you seeing this increase in pace and have a real impact in Volvo supply chain? And then perhaps we can look a bit ahead about what you think the impacts might be and how we should prepare.
I think that's also going to be huge in a very short-term horizon as well. The crisis also highlighted that the ability to give the consumer an alternative way or a better experience to buy the car came. There was some sort of, let's call them soft trials of finding that capacity to do it, and Volvo Cars went down that path. And I think we are planning to go quite aggressively further in offering these alternative business models and solutions, online sales, subscription and lease style sales. Obviously combine that with the electrification of the flow. And I think the agility in the pipeline is going to become even more sharp. I mean, the current distribution model, I'd say, for all of the OEMs is quite Stone Age. And we've been doing the same thing for decades, pretty much point-to-point flows via a traditional method. And we work on filling trucks to go to certain zip codes via some form of storage location. And actually, it's very obvious within 2 or 3 years, we're going to have some form of common pipeline with different business models having a different speed of service with different requirements of service throughout the pipeline. And I think the creativity of what we position where in the pipeline and how fast those different business models move is crucial. So, for example, what comes back on the table is, does the supply chain community take on doing most of the PDI or PDS for the consumer so that we've got a very fast delivery for the last mile? How do we position stocks creatively? How do we then balance that with the current sort of lead times and business model and efficiency of the sort of load factors on the trucks? And then the other added complication, of course, is that electric vehicles either need to move fast through the pipeline, or we need much better infrastructure throughout the vehicle pipeline to make sure that they're maintained, charged, etc., in a way that we've never had to worry about. So even the supply planning and the customer order bank and the velocity of those movements is going to be really crucial. Otherwise, whilst these new business models are really exciting, I mean, I think it's a superbly exciting time to work in this industry. But the big challenge on supply chain now is going to be right front and center of the business, because rightly or wrongly, the business can go to a digital future. If we don't adapt our Stone Age platform and execute it, the whole thing collapses. So particularly on vehicle logistics, I think the industry, we really need to aggressively work together to say, how do we build this future? What should the pipelines look like? Where should we have compounds? How do we build the infrastructure? Because it's coming fast, and we can't work as slowly as we've done in the past with sort of, I'd call it steady, continuous improvement, when actually at the consumer end of our business, this move to digitalization is going to happen faster than we're ready for. So I think this has become the number one strategic challenge for automotive logistics, actually, in the short term.
It's fascinating, and I hope we can all work together to pull this network out of the Stone Age, as you say. But I think just on that point, I mean, that must be an important thing to do with your providers, and given that it's a financially challenging time for many as well. Are you looking at potentially new relationships, ways of working with companies? I mean, areas that perhaps will come more in-house, some will go more outsourced, kind of mixing up the model in that way too.
Hugely. I mean, certainly being very parochial now, I've talked more generally about Volvo Cars and the industry. Our journey in the supply chain logistics function for Volvo Cars is still on a let's say a curve of acceleration. It was only sort of 8 years ago that Volvo Logistics Company was basically an 100% outsourced solution. So it was insourced step by step with the various commodities, and we basically took over an operation and we stopped the bleeding and we delivered the service. And then obviously we've had to sort of take pace with the acceleration of Volvo's growth. But what we haven't had space for is we've been working very much on upstream and very much on operations. But actually our current strategy is, how do we create zero waste and build a network design across both inbound, outbound, and the aftermarket area, which is in our scope, and build those networks for the future. And that's going to involve deep, I say, collaboration, network design with the LSPs in the market. We have to take that outside in insights. I don't think we can rely on building point-to-point solutions for Volvo Cars, and we need to take the expertise from outside. And I think the other big challenge, to be fair to the industry, there are many companies now offering innovative solutions on systems and digitalization and business intelligence, planning tools. And somehow apologies for the international audience, I will use an English expression. We need to be able to see the wood from the trees in the context of there are so many offerings. It's difficult to understand, okay, which one of those offerings should we really focus on and work with to add the long-term value. So yeah, my function needs to become an external insights driven, let's call it a strategic business enabler. We're the umbrella across the whole value chain, and we join the dots and make things happen. And if we can't bring the external insights in, we will never transform our supply chain. And quite frankly, we won't become affordable. It's a commodity that impacts the bottom line of the finished vehicle ultimately. And somehow we need to transform and be affordable at the same time, which is the big paradigm we have right now.
Absolutely. Well, as you outlined, there's some opportunities for providers to grasp some of these opportunities, because I think they represent potential growth areas, but interesting, the impacts on the organization as well. I've got a few audience questions that have come through, and I wanted to turn to one or two and just to engage with our audience here. And this question was voted by a few people to be asked, so let me put it to you. What kinds of new supply chain technology do you find most exciting and would recommend to other supply chain leaders?
I think linked to my last answer, I'll tell you when I find them. That's a bit unfair. I think network design tools I'm quite excited by. We're not using one yet. We're doing it all manually in the old-fashioned way, being very open. But I think that's partly the future. I also think that anything that takes transactional work away from our activities in-house is something that's important. So some form of control planning, control tower, transport planning, whether we insource that or outsource it. I want my team from an operations perspective to be focusing on carrier performance and improving the hardware and the infrastructure. And I want my network design team to be working on planning the networks of the future. So I think in the short term, there's some basic technology like that we need to look at. And it's the phrase we're using is, how do we power up our people to do value add things and strip away all the transactional things they have to do on a day-to-day basis on an Excel spreadsheet or picking up the telephone. So, I don't have a silver bullet answer here for this. I think it's a crucial question, but somehow we've got to spend a lot of time looking and speaking to as many companies as possible and understanding how we can integrate off-the-shelf solutions externally with the architecture of our internal software and business models to really focus on this sort of zero transactional work in-house.
Absolutely. Well, I hope they will uncover some more of those exciting technologies over the next couple of days as well. Let me take another audience question that's been voted quite highly. So this one actually does come back to COVID. So let's dip back into the crisis. How to secure your supply chain in a COVID environment? So in terms of unique methods. So I guess maybe that question is alluding to particular measures that have needed to be put in place that are for Volvo's logistics operations. Sweden is a bit unique in this case, perhaps, but nonetheless, you're a global company. So maybe just give us any examples of new protection measures that you've had to take.
Yeah, I mean, they're very transactional and traditional in a way. I think, like I said earlier, we basically engaged working groups that were meeting on a daily basis, multiple times per day. And it was effectively human brute force and creativity. So the special measures we put in place, I'd say the particular one we used was transferring part supply as demand and sort of operations closures due to the political situation evolved. From a supply chain perspective, it was really securing extra storage space for finished vehicles, planning ahead, taking capacity of parts basically in advance of some of our demand and putting them in, again, short-term storage close to our plants. So there was no rocket science, I would say. I think the long-term question of supply chain resilience is obviously comes to the fore. And then we loop back into this question of systems and processes and integration. So again, that has to be looked at from a value chain perspective. So Apologies to the audience. I'm not really giving any smart, wonderful, magic answers here, but no, I think it was brute force, creativity, agility, and effectively 2 or 3 meetings per day for about 4 or 5 months that got us through the crisis, really.
Well, I think it's valuable insight, and I think it's one that many would recognize. When we, during our live stream season, recently spoke with Volkswagen, and they talked to us about how important spreadsheets were in this time. For all the digitalization that we want to promote, in some ways, Excel might have been the most useful specific tool in the height of this crisis. So, sometimes brute force certainly has a role to play. Another question, this is actually our most highly voted question at the moment. So if you and it relates to the sustainability, but touches on packaging in particular. So if you mention zero waste, what role does packaging play in the supply chain? And in general, what's the packaging strategy for Volvo Cars? So again, I think you mentioned the zero waste side. So you can talk a little bit about the packaging strategy that you see.
Yeah. Again, I guess this will be quite high level, and maybe in other sessions it'll go deeper. I mean, this is fundamental, ultimately. I think Volvo Cars, without being too specific, we've had an internal pool of packaging that we've invested in. Many of it is many years old and decades old. And we continue with that policy of effectively basically designing something that can be picked up from the supplier and almost delivered to line side. And I think moving forward from an agility perspective, the ability to break the packaging down into smaller unit loads, so we can combine smaller unit loads through the logistics network and then speed a last mile delivery to line in a small unit load flow in maybe a lightweight, adaptable box is definitely the long-term way forward. But of course, probably like most OEMs, there's a significant amount of investment in the previous infrastructure. So that is our fundamental challenge. How do we support the sort of transformation within the manufacturing plant and balance that with maximizing our flows outside the plant? So then we'll get into the paradigm of maybe we have a certain bulk packaging we use for maybe the 95% of the kilometers traveled, with some form of handling and kitting and putting into smaller lightweight packaging to go to line. But again, that abandons some of the lean principles, because you're adding a disruption to the flow, you're adding handling and cost. So striking the balance between these things is fundamental. But I think the packaging strategy and modern ways of managing packaging is crucial. I think collaboration comes back in. I think we need to consider, is it something OEM should invest in? Should we lease? Should we pool? And I know these, I've been in automotive now for over 20 years. This has been an ongoing discussion for the last 20 years I've been involved in automotive, and probably longer, as how should we manage this as an industry versus how we manage it as each individual OEM, and what's the most efficient. So again, some form of digitalization and supplier offering through the third parties and the business community. I think there's a gap in the market to fill. I'm not saying people don't exist. There are some big companies doing this, but somehow it's an area where there's a lot of opportunity. Let's put it like that.
Absolutely. So another point I wanted to touch on, because I know you also, and I think this is a fairly new part of your organization, you have responsibility on the service part side of logistics as well. So I just thought, seeing as you have oversight of that now, do you see synergies to integrate more aspects of service parts into inbound or outbound, maybe not even physically, but whether it's from a process or systems point of view?
Sure. I mean, I think the obvious thing, and like most OEMs as well, should service parts logistics be part of the sales organization or the sort of industrial cluster, as we call it. And we've decided to go this way because we believe there's a sort of huge traditional optimization we can do on the actual network itself and our organization. The transport planning, the general cargo transportation is the same for inbound and after sales. We store the parts in warehouses and hubs. We then have last mile distribution. So all of the traditional part, I think we said, okay, let's look at just basic normal synergies in going for RFQs, studying the network design, seeing where there's triangulation on backflows, stripping out duplication of efforts in our organization. So there's that part. I think the exciting part is actually that unlike parts and vehicles, actually we're responsible for the material planning and the availability to the consumer, which is ultimately the dealer and the final customer. And that's where huge revenues are driven. So how creatively we can get the right parts in the right place. There's a lot of data to show that a percentage point increase in availability creates a percentage points increase in profit. So it's really on the bottom line. So looking at BI intelligent tools to really be much more smart in planning the right availability of parts based on the data we get from the vehicle itself and the telematics that we can use today is crucial. And then, of course, there's things like digital printing, which I think is another future innovation that could be a real breakthrough for aftermarkets. It's a real slow-moving beast, ultimately, and we have to carry parts for 15 years to cover the life cycle. And actually, many of these slow-moving parts, if there's a short-term, fast, digitally printed version that meets the quality standards in the future to avoid us storing and doing all-time buys, I think that could be a real revolution in aftermarket. So I think we're talking about the future. It's seen as this sort of dinosaur beast again. Actually, I think it's an area where there's a lot of future technology, systems, business intelligence, which could really harvest profit margins for the industry. And when we transfer to electrification, in actual fact, the profit margins from the aftermarket is likely to reduce. So really ensuring we have the best infrastructure to harvest those in the short term is crucial.
Very exciting, and of course, an area with a lot of e-commerce potential as well. So those digital on-site sales could play a key role. We've only got a minute or so left, and I'm determined to keep things on time. So, last question, but it's really kind of a question in a word. When we talk about sustainability and green logistics, does it and should it also mean that car makers are ready and willing to pay more to have a more sustainable supply chain than not? So I know I'm oversimplifying it, but I'm as much as we can for a one-word answer and a short answer on that.
Okay. The challenge I'm setting my team is no, because I think if we strip waste out, ultimately we're making our supply chain more efficient. So cost and sustainability should go hand in hand. That's my politically correct answer for the moment.
Fair enough. Well, I think we're going to have a lot of time to unpick some of that throughout the sessions here. Martin, this was a great opening. I think it was a perfect way to kick off our event and to look across some of these really strategic, transformative areas of the supply chain. And I think Volvo makes a great case study in this. So thank you for your time now. I know you also will join us on a panel later in the week, and we'll have your colleagues from the inbound side and outbound side on panels as well. So we got plenty of opportunity to interact and get more insights. We really want to thank you. To our audience who've put through a lot of great questions, more questions that we can get to here. We'll save those. Martin will share them with you, and we'll look to address them in other ways and get back to you on that. So keep those questions coming. Keep your insight coming. We'll take a break. You can do networking. However, right after this, if you're interested, we have a session available on China, on some data and some forecasting for what's happening in the China market. So do check out that, and be sure to check out other of our sessions as we go through the day, particularly some upcoming sessions on electric vehicle and battery supply chain. So Christopher Ludwig signing off for now. Thanking Martin Corner again from Volvo. It's been a great first session, and thank you to everyone, and welcome again to our digital conference.
Thanks, Chris.